You ever have a moment where the world slows down and you can see the precise geometry of your own humiliation? For me, it was the sound of my brother-in-law, Grayson, patting my head. Not once, but twice. A soft, dismissive pat, like I was the family golden retriever. He'd lean in, the smell of his expensive cologne and ambition filling my personal space, and he'd say, loud enough for my sister and our cousins to hear, "How's the little hobby, Lara? Keeping those old books from falling apart?" Everyone would chuckle, a gentle, sympathetic sound that was somehow worse than outright laughter. It was the sound of pity, the sound of people who had already written you out of the story. This is my story. And if you've ever been underestimated, if you've ever been patted on the head while someone else set fire to everything you cared about, then maybe this is your story too. So do me a favor, stick with me, hit that like button, and let me know in the comments that I'm not just talking to myself. It helps to know I'm not alone out here. To them, I was Lara, the quiet archivist, the spinster sister-in-law, the keeper of the flame for a fire they all thought had gone out. My grandfather, Caleb Archer, had built an investment firm, Archer and Sons, from nothing but nerve and a preternatural understanding of market tides. But he also loved books, and when he passed, he left the firm to the family and the books to me. It was a division that, in their eyes, perfectly defined our respective roles. Grayson, my sister Clara's brilliant, handsome husband, was the future. He was a shark in a tailored suit, and he would steer the family ship into dazzling new waters. I was the past, a custodian of dusty leather and yellowed paper, a living relic. My little hobby was housed in the west wing of the old family estate, a cavernous library with floor-to-ceiling shelves of oak and the constant, comforting scent of aging paper and binder's glue. This was my sanctuary, but to Grayson, it was just dead weight on the property asset sheet. He never saw the value. He only saw the square footage. The betrayal, when it came, wasn't a dramatic confrontation. It was far more modern, far more sterile. It arrived as a calendar notification on my phone on a Tuesday afternoon. Emergency board meeting, final asset liquidation, it read. I clicked on the attachment, a single cold PDF. The agenda was simple. A vote to authorize the complete liquidation of the Dalton Holdings portfolio. My breath caught in my chest. Dalton Holdings wasn't just another asset. It was the first company my grandfather ever acquired, a small Midwestern manufacturing firm that made high-precision gears. He bought it during a downturn, modernized it, and treated its employees like family. He kept it, even when advisors told him to sell, because he said it was the company's heart. It was a tangible piece of his philosophy. Build things that last. Grayson saw it as a relic, an underperforming anchor holding back his high-risk, high-reward gambles in the volatile tech sector. He'd been chipping away at Grandpa's legacy for a year, selling off stable, slow-growth assets, and pouring the capital into speculative ventures that glittered but had no soul. He'd assured everyone, especially my sister, that it was what Grandpa would have wanted. He was a visionary, Grayson would say at Sunday dinners, and visionaries don't look backward. I looked at the PDF again. The vote was a formality. Grayson had charmed the board, a collection of distant cousins and old family friends who were more intimidated by his aggressive confidence than they were loyal to my grandfather's memory. They wanted to believe in his vision of easy, explosive wealth. They were ready to trade a legacy for a windfall. I closed my laptop. The silence of the library felt different now. It wasn't peaceful. It was the silence of a tomb. Grayson thought he was a visionary. He thought he was honoring my grandfather by being bold, by being ruthless. He thought I was just the quiet girl who looked after the books. What Grayson didn't know, what no one in my family knew, was that my grandfather hadn't just been a collector. He was a master bookbinder, and for the last 10 years of his life, he had been a patient and meticulous teacher. And his most important lessons, his truest legacy, weren't written in his will. They were hidden in plain sight, waiting for the one person he knew would have the patience to look. The emergency meeting was in 2 days. Grayson was about to bulldoze the heart of the company. He thought he was holding an execution. He had no idea he was actually walking into a succession. He patted my head and called my life's work a hobby. But a hobby is something you do for pleasure. My work in this library, this was something I did for love and for war. The email notification had been a digital chime, a sterile, impersonal sound that announced the impending death of my grandfather's world. I sat there in the library, the glow of the monitor reflecting in my glasses, and a profound hollow coldness seeped into my bones. It wasn't anger, not yet. It was the chilling calm that comes after the lightning strike, the silence before the thunder rolls. The world narrowed to the words on the screen. Dalton Holdings, final liquidation, emergency meeting. Each phrase was a hammer blow against the foundation of everything my grandfather had built. I pushed back from my desk, the old wooden chair groaning in protest. The library, my sanctuary, suddenly felt vast and oppressive. The thousands of books lining the walls, each one a silent witness, seemed to be holding their breath. For years, this room had been my refuge from the loud, sharp-edged world of my family. A world where Grayson's pronouncements were treated as gospel, and my quiet work was a quaint eccentricity. In here there was order, there was history, there was the tangible weight of knowledge in my hands. Out there was just noise. The frantic, self-important noise of men like Grayson, who mistook volume for value. I walked over to the tall, mullioned windows that overlooked the manicured lawns of the estate. The sun was setting, casting long, mournful shadows across the grass. This was the moment I had been dreading, in a strange, dark corner of my heart, preparing for. This was the fire alarm my grandfather had told me to listen for. My mind slipped back over a decade, the memory as clear and sharp as a shard of glass. I was 16, all elbows and awkward silence, hiding from a boisterous family party in this very library. My grandfather found me in the restoration corner, trying to repair the tattered spine of an old copy of Moby Dick. The smell of PVA glue and warm leather filled the air. He didn't scold me for being antisocial. He pulled up a stool. He said, "Lara, you have a bookbinder's hands. Quiet, patient, precise. You don't force things. You feel the grain of the paper, the tension of the thread. You listen to what the book wants to be." He took the book from my hands and showed me how to tool the leather, how to set the type for the gilded title. It wasn't a one-time lesson. It became our ritual. For the next 10 years, while Grayson was out getting his MBA and charming his way up the corporate ladder, I was in this room, learning a dying art from a master. He taught me about paper weights and end bands, about marbled paper and blind tooling. But he was also teaching me something else. He was teaching me about secrets. One evening, he pulled out a slim volume, a first edition of Machiavelli's The Prince. He showed me the spine. It looked perfect, just a simple, elegant leather binding. But then he handed me a high-powered jeweler's loupe and angled a bright lamp just so. He said, "Look closer, Lara." In the grooves of the tooling, I pressed the loupe to my eye, and my world tilted. There, infinitesimally small, were letters, micro-engraved into the leather itself, so small they were invisible to the naked eye, hidden within the decorative lines of the binding. It was a technique he'd perfected, a fusion of old-world craft and modern technology, a message in a bottle, cast into a sea of books. He told me then, his voice low and serious, "Some things, Lara, are too important for a single piece of paper in a lawyer's dusty file. A will can be contested, a trust can be broken, people can be swayed by loud voices and shiny promises, but a secret, hidden in a place no one thinks to look, that has a power all its own." He told me he was creating a fail-safe, a last line of defense for his life's work. He said he was putting his faith, not in lawyers, but in my patience, in my quiet nature. in the fact that no one would ever see me coming. He made me promise, "Don't use this unless the wolf is truly at the door. Don't use this for a squabble or a disagreement. Wait until they try to burn it all down. Then, and only then, you show them the real foundation of this house." The memory faded, leaving me alone again by the window. The wolf was at the door. Grayson wasn't just knocking, he was holding a battering ram. The cold in my bones began to shift, to solidify into something hard and dense. It was resolve, a quiet, unyielding certainty that settled deep in my gut. It wasn't about revenge. I kept telling myself that, and I almost believed it. It wasn't about punishing Grayson for his arrogance, for the years of condescending pats on my head. It was about my promise. It was about the integrity of a legacy, built not on speculation, but on substance. I thought of another person my grandfather had trusted, Alistair Finch. When I was a teenager, Alistair was a junior lawyer at the firm that handled my grandfather's estate. He was young, sharp, and one of the few people who didn't speak to my grandfather with the cloying deference of a subordinate. They debated. They argued. Grandpa liked that. He called Alistair a healthy skeptic. I remembered one afternoon, the three of us were in the library, and Grandpa was showing Alistair a particularly rare book. He'd put a hand on my shoulder and said to the lawyer, "Remember this one, Alistair. Lara sees the patterns everyone else misses. When the time comes, trust her eye." Alistair had just nodded, a polite, professional smile on his face. He probably thought it was just the ramblings of an old man, a grandfather's doting praise. He couldn't have known it was a directive, a key, being placed in his hand for a lock he didn't even know existed. Now, years later, Alistair was a senior partner. I hadn't spoken to him in years, not since the funeral. Would he remember? Would he honor the words of a dead man over the demands of the very much alive and powerful new head of the family firm? It was a risk, but every part of my grandfather's plan was a risk. It was a bet on character over convenience, a bet on loyalty over greed. The final piece of my resolve clicked into place as I walked towards a specific shelf, the one dedicated to first editions of economic and military philosophy. My fingers traced the spines, the familiar feel of the aged leather a comfort. I pulled down a worn copy of Sun Tzu's The Art of War. It was one of the 5. As I opened the cover, a small folded piece of vellum, tucked into the flyleaf, fell onto the floor. It was my grandfather's handwriting, the familiar, elegant script, shaky with age. I had dusted this book 100 times, and I had never seen this note before. He must have placed it there just before he passed, knowing I would be the only one to ever open it with care. It was just one sentence. "The wolf is at the door. Time to show him the strength of the house." The last vestiges of doubt, of fear, of hesitation, evaporated in a quiet heat that flushed up my neck. It was more than a note. It was permission. It was a final command from my general. The time for being the quiet archivist was over. The time for being the protector had come. I wasn't just managing a collection of books anymore. I was armed. Grayson was about to find out that the dustiest corners of history sometimes hide the sharpest weapons, and I knew how to use every single one of them. It wasn't about making a scene. It was about ending one. The plan had been laid a decade ago, a seed planted in the rich soil of my grandfather's foresight. Now it was time to see if it would bloom. The work wasn't in creating the strategy, but in executing it with the same quiet precision my grandfather had taught me. The foundation was already there, hidden in plain sight. The first step was to gather the arsenal. There were 5 specific books, the cornerstones of my grandfather's private collection, and as it turned out, his true last will and testament. They weren't ostentatious or flashy. To an outsider, they were just valuable first editions. To me, they were the 5 pillars of the entire firm. There was Adam Smith's The Wealth of Nations, bound in a deep burgundy calfskin. Its spine held the codicil that established the legal framework of the Caleb Archer Legacy Trust. It was the Constitution. Then came Sun Tzu's The Art of War, in a simple, almost severe black goat leather. Its engravings laid out the conditions for the trust's activation, a threat to the firm's foundational assets, specifically naming Dalton Holdings for the purpose of high-risk speculative investment. It was the trigger. The third was a lesser-known volume, a treatise on metallurgy by an 18th century engineer, bound in a faded blue. This one contained the operational clauses, transferring the controlling interest of Archer and Sons, a full 60% of the voting shares, to the trust. It was the mechanism of the coup. The fourth and fifth books were more personal. A first edition of Marcus Aurelius's Meditations, its vellum cover soft as silk, held the instructions for the trust's management, naming me, Lara Elizabeth Archer, as the sole non-removable trustee. It was the appointment. And finally, a slim volume of poetry by a local poet my grandfather had admired, bound in a simple, unassuming brown leather. This one was the fail-safe. It transferred the legal rights to the Archer family name and my grandfather's likeness to the trust, a poisoned pill designed to neutralize the very branding Grayson was using to build his new empire. It was the checkmate. For an hour I sat at my workbench, the 5 books laid out before me on a soft felt cloth, under the intense focused beam of the bookbinder's lamp, and with my grandfather's favorite brass loop, I reread every microscopic word he had so carefully engraved. The detail was breathtaking. It was his voice, his will, his unshakable principles, etched into the very fabric of his passions. This wasn't a legal document. It was a manifesto. He wasn't just transferring shares, he was transferring a soul. The next step was to bring in the only ally my grandfather had designated, Alistair Finch. My heart hammered against my ribs as I looked up his firm's number. He was a powerful man now. What if he refused? What if he saw this as a family squabble he wanted no part of? What if he simply didn't believe me? The entire plan hinged on this man's memory and integrity. I dialed the number. A crisp, professional receptionist put me through. Alistair Finch. His voice was deeper than I remembered, edged with the easy authority of a man accustomed to being in charge. Alistair, it's Lara Archer, Caleb Archer's granddaughter. There was a pause. For a terrifying second, I thought he wouldn't remember. Then his tone softened, a flicker of warmth breaking through the corporate shell. Lara, my goodness, it's been a long time. How are you? How is the library? He remembered the library. It was a good sign. I'm well, thank you. The library is under threat. I took a deep breath. There was no way to ease into this. Alistair, I need your help. It's about my grandfather's will. His will. Lara, the estate was settled years ago. Everything is in order. There it was. The professional skepticism. Not everything, I said. My voice steady. My grandfather created a series of codicils. They were not filed with the estate. Unfiled codicils. Where are they? Why are you only bringing this up now? His voice was sharp with legal suspicion. A plausible inaccuracy in my story, I knew. Unfiled codicils are a legal minefield. But my grandfather's plan was never about legal convenience. It was about dramatic, undeniable force. They are in a place no one would think to look. And I'm bringing them up now, because the conditions for their activation have been met. My brother-in-law, Grayson, has called an emergency board meeting for tomorrow to liquidate Dalton Holdings. I heard him sigh, a sound of weary frustration. Yes, I've heard rumors about Grayson's aggressive new strategy. Several of your grandfather's old partners have called me, concerned. But Lara, even if these codicils exist, proving their authenticity on such short notice is nearly impossible. A challenge like this could be tied up in court for years. This was the moment of truth. He knew you'd say that, I said quietly. He anticipated the skepticism. He called you a healthy skeptics. Another pause. This one was longer. I could almost hear the gears turning in his mind, the memory of my grandfather's words echoing across the years. He told you that? Alistair asked, his voice softer now. He also told me to tell you that he wasn't placing his faith in the courts. He was placing it in my eye for detail, and in your integrity. I let the words hang in the air. I have the codicils in front of me. They are micro-engraved into the bindings of 5 books. I can send you high-resolution scans right now. You'll know what to do. The last vestiges of doubt, of fear, of hesitation, evaporated in a quiet heat that flushed up my neck. It was more than a note. It was permission. It was a final command from my general. The time for being the quiet archivist was over. The time for being the protector had come. I wasn't just managing a collection of books anymore. I was armed. Grayson was about to find out that the dustiest corners of history sometimes hide the sharpest weapons, and I knew how to use every single one of them. It wasn't about making a scene. It was about ending one. The plan had been laid a decade ago, a seed planted in the rich soil of my grandfather's foresight. Now it was time to see if it would bloom. The work wasn't in creating the strategy, but in executing it with the same quiet precision my grandfather had taught me. The foundation was already there, hidden in plain sight. The first step was to gather the arsenal. There were 5 specific books, the cornerstones of my grandfather's private collection, and as it turned out, his true last will and testament. They weren't ostentatious or flashy. To an outsider, they were just valuable first editions. To me, they were the 5 pillars of the entire firm. There was Adam Smith's The Wealth of Nations, bound in a deep burgundy calfskin. Its spine held the codicil that established the legal framework of the Caleb Archer Legacy Trust. It was the Constitution. Then came Sun Tzu's The Art of War, in a simple, almost severe black goat leather. Its engravings laid out the conditions for the trust's activation, a threat to the firm's foundational assets, specifically naming Dalton Holdings for the purpose of high-risk speculative investment. It was the trigger. The third was a lesser-known volume, a treatise on metallurgy by an 18th century engineer, bound in a faded blue. This one contained the operational clauses, transferring the controlling interest of Archer and Sons, a full 60% of the voting shares, to the trust. It was the mechanism of the coup. The 4th and 5th books were more personal. A first edition of Marcus Aurelius's Meditations, its vellum cover soft as silk, held the instructions for the trust's management, naming me, Laura Elizabeth Archer, as the sole non-removable trustee. It was the appointment. And finally, a slim volume of poetry by a local poet my grandfather had admired, bound in a simple, unassuming brown leather. This one was the fail-safe. It transferred the legal rights to the Archer family name and my grandfather's likeness to the trust, a poisoned pill designed to neutralize the very branding Grayson was using to build his new empire. It was the checkmate. For an hour I sat at my workbench, the 5 books laid out before me on a soft felt cloth, under the intense focused beam of the bookbinder's lamp, and with my grandfather's favorite brass loop, I reread every microscopic word he had so carefully engraved. The detail was breathtaking. It was his voice, his will, his unshakable principles, etched into the very fabric of his passions. This wasn't a legal document. It was a manifesto. He wasn't just transferring shares, he was transferring a soul. The next step was to bring in the only ally my grandfather had designated, Alistair Finch. My heart hammered against my ribs as I looked up his firm's number. He was a powerful man now. What if he refused? What if he saw this as a family squabble he wanted no part of? What if he simply didn't believe me? The entire plan hinged on this man's memory and integrity. I dialed the number. A crisp, professional receptionist put me through. Alistair Finch. His voice was deeper than I remembered, edged with the easy authority of a man accustomed to being in charge. "Alistair, it's Lara Archer, Caleb Archer's granddaughter." There was a pause. For a terrifying second, I thought he wouldn't remember. Then his tone softened, a flicker of warmth breaking through the corporate shell. "Lara, my goodness, it's been a long time. How are you? How is the library?" He remembered the library. It was a good sign. "I'm well, thank you." "The library is under threat." I took a deep breath. There was no way to ease into this. "Alistair, I need your help. It's about my grandfather's will." "His will?" "Lara, the estate was settled years ago. Everything is in order." There it was. The professional skepticism. "Not everything," I said, my voice steady. "My grandfather created a series of codicils. They were not filed with the estate. Unfiled codicils. Where are they? Why are you only bringing this up now?" His voice was sharp with legal suspicion. A plausible inaccuracy in my story, I knew. Unfiled codicils are a legal minefield. But my grandfather's plan was never about legal convenience. It was about dramatic, undeniable force. They are in a place no one would think to look. And I'm bringing them up now, because the conditions for their activation have been met. My brother-in-law, Grayson, has called an emergency board meeting for tomorrow to liquidate Dalton Holdings. I heard him sigh, a sound of weary frustration. "Yes, I've heard rumors about Grayson's aggressive new strategy. Several of your grandfather's old partners have called me, concerned. But Lara, even if these codicils exist, proving their authenticity on such short notice is nearly impossible. A challenge like this could be tied up in court for years." This was the moment of truth. "He knew you'd say that," I said quietly. He anticipated the skepticism. "He called you a healthy skeptics." Another pause. This one was longer. I could almost hear the gears turning in his mind, the memory of my grandfather's words echoing across the years. "He told you that?" Alistair asked, his voice softer now. "He also told me to tell you that he wasn't placing his faith in the courts. He was placing it in my eye for detail, and in your integrity." I let the words hang in the air. "I have the codicils in front of me. They are micro-engraved into the bindings of 5 books. I can send you high-resolution scans right now. You'll know what to do." Grayson saw me, and a wide, condescending smirk spread across his face. "Lara, I'm surprised to see you. Did you get lost? The library is on the other side of town." A few of the board members chuckled nervously. Chad snickered. I felt the old familiar heat of humiliation creep up my neck, but this time it was different. It wasn't shame. It was fuel. I didn't answer him. I walked silently to an empty chair at the far end of the table, placed my leather satchel beside it, and sat down. My silence seemed to unnerve him more than any retort could have. He cleared his throat, the smirk tightening into a mask of irritation. "Well," he began, clicking a button to bring his presentation up on the massive screen at the front of the room. "Welcome, everyone. We're here today to take a final, decisive step into the future, to unlock the value that has been trapped in the past." He launched into his speech. It was the same one I'd heard him practice at family dinners, full of empty corporate jargon. Synergy, disruption, paradigm shift, unlocking latent value. He painted a picture of Dalton Holdings as a rusty anchor, a sentimental relic that was holding the family back from a glorious tech-fueled future. The board members were nodding along, their faces reflecting a mixture of greed and a desire for this to all be over quickly. He was in his element. He was a performer, and this was his stage. He paced. He used hand gestures, his voice rising and falling with practiced passion. The panic I had expected to see was nowhere in sight. He was confident, arrogant. He thought he had already won. He hadn't seen the email. He didn't know Alistair was coming. For a moment, a sliver of doubt entered my mind. What if Alistair didn't show? What if his experts found a flaw? Grayson moved to his final slide, a stark, bold font declaration, motion to approve the full liquidation of Dalton Holdings. So, he said, spreading his hands wide in a gesture of magnanimous finality, I now call for a vote. All in favor, and at that exact moment, the boardroom doors swung open. It wasn't a dramatic entrance, it was quiet, professional, and utterly devastating. Alistair Finch strode in, looking every inch the powerful senior partner he was. He was not alone. Flanking him were two people, a man and a woman, dressed not in suits, but in the practical no-nonsense attire of technical specialists. The woman carried a heavy-duty Pelican case. Grayson froze, his hand still in the air. His jaw went slack. The confident performer vanished, replaced by a man suddenly realizing he'd walked onto the wrong stage. Alistair, he stammered, his voice a full octave higher than it had been a moment before. What is this? This is a closed board meeting. Alistair didn't even look at Grayson. His eyes scanned the room and settled on me. He gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. Then he turned his cool, assessing gaze onto my brother-in-law. I'm aware of that, Grayson, Alistair said, his voice calm and carrying easily across the suddenly silent room. I'm here as legal counsel. Grayson's face was a mess of confusion and burgeoning panic. Legal counsel? For who? The board is represented by corporate counsel. They're right here. He gestured wildly at the company lawyer, who looked just as bewildered as everyone else. Alistair walked slowly toward the table, his presence commanding the absolute attention of every person in the room. He stopped and stood directly behind my chair. I'm not here representing the board, he said, his voice dropping slightly, taking on a tone of clinical precision. I'm here representing the controlling shareholder. A murmur went through the room. Grayson's face, which had been pale, was now draining of all color. He stared at Alistair, then his gaze flicked to me, sitting silently at the end of the table. A flicker of understanding, and pure, unadulterated terror, dawned in his eyes. He still didn't get it, not completely, but he knew something was terribly, terribly wrong. The foundation of his world was cracking beneath his feet. Controlling shareholder. Chad, his sycophant, blurted out. That's not possible. We have the proxies. The family controls the firm. Alistair ignored him. He looked at me. Lara, he said calmly, I believe you have something for the board to review. The power in the room had begun to shift. It was an almost physical sensation, like the change in air pressure before an earthquake. It was draining away from Grayson, who stood frozen at the head of the table, and it was coalescing around me, the quiet woman at the other end. I stood up. I didn't say a word. I picked up my grandfather's leather satchel, walked to the polished mahogany expanse of the boardroom table, and with a soft, definitive thud, placed the 5 books in a neat row in the center. The silence that followed was absolute. The board members stared at the books. Grayson stared at the books. They were just old books. But in that moment, in that room, they felt like 5 sticks of dynamite with their fuses lit. The silent takeover had begun. The 5 books sat on the gleaming table, a stark contrast of old leather and paper against the modern, sterile backdrop of the boardroom. For a long moment, no one moved. They were all staring, trying to compute what was happening. Grayson finally found his voice, a strangled, incredulous squawk. Books? You interrupted a board meeting to show us books? Is this a joke? He looked around the room, seeking validation, but found only confused and wary faces. The tide of opinion was turning, and he could feel it. I still didn't speak. My silence was my weapon. It was forcing everyone else to fill the void, and they were filling it with their own mounting anxiety. Alistair took charge, his voice a calm, authoritative anchor in the swirling sea of confusion. These are not just books, Grayson. They are legal instruments. My colleagues, he said, gesturing to the 2 specialists who had entered with him, are Dr. Anya Sharma, a certified document examiner specializing in historical manuscripts, and Mr. Ben Carter, a micrography expert from the forensics lab. They are here to verify the authenticity of 5 codicils to Caleb Archer's last will and testament. He let that sink in. The word codicils sent a fresh wave of shock through the room. Grayson laughed, a high, unhinged sound. Codicils? You're insane. The will was executed years ago. There are no codicils. This is a pathetic, desperate stunt. He pointed a shaking finger at me. She's a librarian. She probably forged them in her little basement workshop. That is a serious accusation, Alistair said, his voice dropping to an icy calm, and one you may want to reconsider. Dr. Sharma, if you would. Dr. Sharma, a woman with an air of quiet academic authority, opened the Pelican case. She didn't produce dusty legal papers. She took out a portable digital microscope, a specialized light source, and a laptop. The board members leaned in, their fear now mixed with a palpable curiosity. She began with The Wealth of Nations. She handled the book with a reverence that made my heart ache with pride. She set up her equipment, positioning the microscope's camera over the book's spine. Then Carter connected her laptop to the large presentation screen at the front of the room, the one Grayson had just been using for his slideshow. The screen flickered to life. At first it just showed a magnified, blurry image of the burgundy leather. Dr. Sharma adjusted the focus. The image sharpened, zooming in on one of the gilded lines of the decorative tooling. And then we all saw it. There, nestled within the groove of the gold leaf, were words, perfectly formed, infinitesimally small letters, a secret language hidden in plain sight. A collective gasp went through the room. Alistair stepped forward. As you can see, he said calmly, Caleb Archer, a master bookbinder in his own right, used a micro-engraving technique to add these codicils directly to the bindings of his most prized possessions. Dr. Sharma has already authenticated the age of the engravings and confirmed they match the timeline of Caleb's final years. She will now read the text of the first codicil. Dr. Sharma, reading from her monitor, spoke in a clear, measured voice. Codicil 1, dated October 14th. I hereby establish the Caleb Archer Legacy Trust, a legal entity for the sole purpose of protecting and preserving the foundational principles and assets of Archer and Sons. She moved to the next book, The Art of War. The process was repeated. More microscopic text filled the screen. The trust shall be activated and assume all controlling authority in the event that a motion is put forward to liquidate, in whole or in part, the portfolio of Dalton Holdings for any speculative purpose. Grayson's face was ashen. He looked like he'd been punched in the gut. This is theater. It's not legal. On the contrary, Alistair countered smoothly. It's highly unorthodox, but our initial review suggests it's perfectly legal. A holographic will, or in this case codicil, requires only that it be demonstrably in the testator's hand. Caleb was clever. The engraving technique is so unique, it's like a fingerprint. It is demonstrably his work. Dr. Sharma moved to the third book, The Metallurgy Treatise. The text of the third codicil appeared on the screen. Upon activation, a 60% controlling interest of all voting shares of Archer and Sons shall be immediately transferred to the Caleb Archer Legacy Trust. The room erupted in frantic whispers. 60%. It wasn't a challenge. It was a complete takeover. Grayson stumbled back a step, his hand gripping the edge of the table to steady himself. His eyes were wide with panic, darting around the room, looking for an ally, a lifeline. He found none. The board members who had been nodding along to his presentation just minutes before were now staring at him with a mixture of horror and dawning fury. They had been lied to. They had been led to the brink of a disaster. He turned his desperate gaze on my sister, who had come to stand in the doorway, drawn by the commotion. Clara, tell them this is insane. Tell them she's always been jealous, that she's making this up. Clara just stared, her face a pale mask of shock and confusion. She looked from the books on the table, to the microscopic words on the screen, to me, Her world, built on the foundation of her husband's brilliance, was disintegrating before her eyes. Dr. Sharma, oblivious to the drama, moved to the final 2 books. She read the codicil from Meditations, naming me as sole irremovable trustee, and then the final devastating blow from the slim book of poetry. All rights, titles and interests associated with the Archer name and the likeness of Caleb Archer for commercial purposes are hereby vested solely in the trust. Alistair let the words hang in the silent room. Then he delivered the final clinical stroke, which means, Grayson, that the Archer Legacy Ventures branding you've been using for your new shell corporation is an infringement. The trust now owns your name. It was over. Grayson's power, his bluster, his entire carefully constructed world, had not just been challenged. It had been dissolved. It had evaporated right before his eyes, defeated by a dead man's foresight and a quiet woman's patience. He opened his mouth, but no sound came out. The shark had been beached, the visionary had been blinded, and it had all been done without me raising my voice. I just brought the books. The final confrontation wasn't a shouting match. It wasn't a dramatic, tear-filled scene. That was Grayson's style, not mine. My victory was in the silence that followed the storm, in the quiet, irreversible shift of reality. After Alistair's final pronouncement, the board meeting didn't end. It simply fractured. The company lawyer was huddled with Alistair, his face pale, looking over the preliminary legal opinion Alistair's team had prepared. The board members were speaking in hushed, frantic tones, their allegiances visibly shifting away from the toxic asset that was now Grayson. Grayson, for his part, just stood there for a long moment, swaying slightly, like a building after an earthquake, structurally unsound and about to collapse. Then, his survival instincts kicked in. He made a beeline for me as I was carefully packing the 5 books back into their protective sleeves. "Lara." His voice was a raw, desperate whisper. He grabbed my arm. "Lara, what have you done? We can fix this. We're family. We can undo this. Just tell them you made a mistake." I stopped what I was doing and looked at him. I looked into his eyes, which were wild with a terror I had never seen before. The arrogance was gone, scraped away, leaving only raw, pathetic fear. I didn't feel triumph. I didn't feel anger. I just felt a profound, weary pity. He still didn't understand. He thought this was a negotiation. I gently removed his hand from my arm. I looked him directly in the eye and gave him a small, quiet smile. And then I used his own words, the same ones he had used to dismiss me for years, as the final, closing statement. "Just managing my little hobby, Grayson," I said softly. Then I turned my back on him, zipped up the leather satchel, and walked out of the room, leaving him in the wreckage of his own making. I didn't look back. The days that followed were a blur of calculated, decisive action. It wasn't about revenge, it was about restoration. The first order of business as trustee was to call a new meeting. This time, it wasn't an emergency meeting, it was a strategy session. I sat at the head of the table, in the chair Grayson had occupied. Alistair sat at my right hand. I didn't present a slideshow, I just spoke. I laid out my grandfather's vision, not as a relic of the past, but as a blueprint for a stable, sustainable future. We weren't going to liquidate Dalton Holdings. We were going to reinvest in it. We were going to fund its new R&D division, expand its apprenticeship program, and use its quiet, consistent strength as the anchor for the entire firm. We were going to build things that last. Some board members, the ones most loyal to Grayson's get-rich-quick schemes, resigned in disgrace. The others, the ones who had been merely swayed or intimidated, pledged their immediate and unwavering loyalty to the trust. They saw the truth now. They saw that my grandfather's legacy wasn't in a stock ticker, it was in the principles he had literally woven into the fabric of his library. The fallout with my family was complicated. My sister Clara came to the library a week later. She didn't yell, she didn't accuse, she just looked lost. She sat in one of the big leather armchairs, looking small and fragile in the vast, quiet room. "Why, Lara?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Why didn't you tell me? Why did you let it get to that point? You humiliated him." I sat across from her. I didn't try to defend myself. I tried to make her understand. I didn't do this to Grayson, Clara. I did it for Grandpa. He knew someone like Grayson might come along one day. Someone charming and ambitious and utterly convinced that the past is something to be demolished instead of learned from. He didn't build a weapon. He built a safety net. I walked over to the shelves and pulled down the slim volume of poetry. He left this for me to find. He knew I would be the only one to look. It was a promise I had to keep. She looked at the book, then at me. I could see the conflict in her eyes, the love for her husband warring with the undeniable truth of what he had tried to do. "He said it was what Grandpa would have wanted," she said, more to herself than to me. "Grandpa wanted the family to be secure." I replied gently. "Grayson wanted the family to be rich. They are not the same thing. The family isn't broken, Clara. But the part of it that was built on a lie had to be taken down. It wasn't a perfect resolution. It would take time for that wound to heal. But it was a start. It was the truth. Debatable character logic, perhaps, to be so gentle with the one who stood by my tormentor. But she was my sister. My goal was never to burn every bridge, only the ones that led to ruin. The final piece of the old reality fell away 2 weeks later. I received a short formal email from Alistair. The remaining board members, in their first official act under the trust's authority, had voted unanimously to terminate Grayson's employment for gross mismanagement and fiduciary neglect. Chad was let go the same day. There was no golden parachute. The trust now owned the Archer name, so his Archer Legacy Ventures was a dead entity. He had nothing. His power hadn't just dissolved. It had been erased. They saw a quiet woman in a dusty room, and they made a fatal miscalculation. They assumed that quiet meant weak. They assumed that a love for the past meant a fear of the future. They thought my world was small and insignificant, a little hobby to be patronized. They never once stopped to consider that the archivist knows where all the bodies are buried. They never considered that the bookbinder knows that the spine is the source of all strength. I'm sitting in my grandfather's office now. It's not a museum anymore. I've had the heavy velvet curtains taken down, and sunlight streams through the tall windows. The old, heavy desk is still here, but it's covered in active project files and market analyses, not a fine layer of dust. In the corner, there's a custom-built, climate-controlled glass case. Inside, displayed like the crown jewels, are 5 old books. They are the company's constitution, a daily reminder that our foundation is not built on risky bets, but on principles worth preserving. My work is not about revenge. I have to believe that. It was about restoration. It was about honoring a promise made to a man who saw the future and trusted me to protect it. Grayson's power didn't just dissolve. It was a phantom. It was never real. It was built on charm and bluster, and when confronted with something real, something with the weight of history and conviction, it simply vanished. The truth is, true power isn't loud. It doesn't need to announce itself. It's the quiet, steady, and unbreakable strength you build when no one is watching. It's the foundation you lay, stone by stone, while everyone else is distracted by the fireworks. They might pat you on the head. They might call your life's work a little hobby. They might write you out of the story completely. Let them. Let them underestimate you. Let them believe you are nothing more than the quiet keeper of a dusty room. Because when the time comes, when the wolf is at their door, they will learn that the quietest people often have the most to say, and that the library holds all the power you will ever need. Thank you for listening to my story. If it resonated with you, if you've ever felt like the underestimated person in the room, please do me a favor, like this video. Leave a comment below, and share your own experiences. And of course, hit that subscribe button and the notification bell. Let's build a community of quiet, powerful people. Let's show them what we can do.